I joke with my kids all the time, I'm gonna have an RV, park it on their driveway, we're good to go.
At the end of the day, you don't want to regret what you did. You want to minimize regret.
It's not as cheap it was when you bought it 30 years ago. That's the issue.
I know so many people decide to move to a quieter place during retirement. However, I'm not sure that's me.
I enjoy being social and being around people.
But I also want to make a responsible decision for choosing where to retire. What should I consider?
Very simple, how much you can afford. I would love to retire and be in an expensive island somewhere and travel 5 times to exotic places, right? It all is going to depend on what you can afford.
There are many things you should consider when it comes to potentially relocating during retirement. One of the first things I think of is healthcare, right? As we get older, it's inevitable we eventually have more and more health conditions and things that we need to address. Where are you in proximity to your doctors? Where are you in proximity to a hospital, even a pharmacy to get your medications? So it's very important from a healthcare perspective. Also just cost of living, right? Are you relocating to somewhere that's attainable, or is this a dream that might be a bit of a stretch? You need to be well aware financially, what is the cost of living going to be? What's the tax situation going to be, right? Sometimes people make the decision to say, well, this state doesn't have any income taxes, so I'll go there. You need to be aware of all taxes associated with making that transition. What do property taxes look like, right? Does the state tax your pension? Do they tax your Social Security? So don't just make it based on one decision there.
The downsize is relative. So everyone thinks, just getting a smaller house is going to be cheaper. It's not often. Usually you're making a lateral. You're giving up $3,000 to go to $1,500. It's the same price. So really setting up the expectation on maybe this new house costs as much as your current house. Let's see, can you do an all cash buy? Do you have to have a little mortgage? Do you have to use some investments? And I think that's been the hard part, that everybody thinks downsize inherently means much cheaper. It's not as cheap it was when you bought it 30 years ago. That's the issue.
Another factor that plays into it is your children and grandchildren. How close are you going to be to them? You might assume that if they're just a few hours away, you'll drive and see them, they'll drive and see you. What I often see with clients is their children and grandchildren start to live busy lives. And it's not always easy for them to transition and make those journeys over to where you live. So even though you're only a few hours away, they've got soccer on the weekend and swim classes, and it's just not as convenient. And you don't want to regret being a few hours away. So you have to take that into consideration as well.
Don't abandon your friend circle, right? Don't just all of a sudden pick up and move to another state, because now you have to get a whole new set of friends that may be harder to find, and you may not like them as much. So really finding the value of that close-knit group and building a life close to them, and maybe being a snowbird, right? Find that happy medium, because really the kids are gonna move, the grandkids are gonna move. That friend group that you have, that trusted friend group, you guys can age together in place and have a good support network.
So in terms of relocating in retirement, this is not just a financial decision. Certainly your finances are extremely important, but you need to think about all dynamics when this comes into consideration. You might be used to being very social where you are now. You might engage in groups, or you've got regular Friday nights we go out to dinner with these couples, whatever that dynamic might be. If that doesn't exist where you go to next, that could be extremely disappointing.
We save and wait our entire lives to do these things that we want to do. Having retired many people, here's what I realized. That very exciting thing that we think we're going to do, we may only want to do for 5 years. We may only want to do for 3 years. So do not shape your entire retirement persona on this I want to be a city girl, because you may get there and realize loud noises mess with you now, because you thought that it was a good idea when you were in college, or you haven't done it your entire life. So chunk out those things and experiment with them.
So when I have that client who's a few years away from retiring and they're thinking about where their forever home is, I say go beta test a couple places, right? I use Phoenix as a prime example. Like, most people don't want to be there in the summertime, but you would only know that if you were there 4 seasons out of the year, right? So Go try different places, go try different communities. I've also found that those people who do find the quieter place, what ends up happening is the medical facilities aren't so great. So they end up trying to move back to the city. So I really try to walk a few steps going, what are your plans? Like, I want to buy an RV, I want to travel the world, great. The RV lifestyle is typically about 10 years because I had a client call me from New Mexico, changing the crapper on the freeway at 12 o'clock going, Jason, I'm done.
I have a situation where I had some clients relocate from Northern Virginia and they moved to North Carolina. This was brand new for them, and I had encouraged them, you should rent for some short-term period. Maybe it's 3 months, 6 months, even a 12-month lease, and try it out, right? You might find out you like where you are, but perhaps you need to be in a different part of the area, right? You're on this side of town, you could be on the other part of town. So that is certainly an important one. And what happened with them, for a variety of reasons, they decided North Carolina was no longer appropriate for them, and they wanted to relocate back to Northern Virginia. The problem is the community that they were living in prior to moving was no longer affordable. And so now they find themselves back in Virginia, about an hour away from where they had lived for many, many years. This was not a dynamic they were looking for. I know the wife drives up an hour frequently to meet with friends and then drive home. And so you don't want to make an irrevocable decision, right? Talk to somebody who's been through this, right? This is the first time you're deciding whether or not you should relocate somewhere. We've talked to hundreds, thousands of people that relocate in retirement. Talk to a professional because you just don't know what you don't know.
I had this wonderful couple. They retired. They've always wanted to live overseas. And they decided to lease their house in Georgia, rent a little apartment in Porto, in Portugal, and move there for a year, just to find out they don't like to be in a country where they don't speak the language. So they moved right back. And they have done that actually. They've moved to Mexico in an area where, people speak more English. Then they came back, and now they are back in Georgia. So retirement, again, doesn't have to be this linear thing. If you think you're not gonna like the quiet place, there is nothing wrong with rearranging your finances to try it out. Therefore, if it doesn't work out, you can move right back to home base, so to speak. So yeah, experiment during that time.
The buyer's remorse effectively is going, it's okay. Maybe you're not happy there. Can we fix this? Can you buy someplace else? But let's think it through. Like the challenge that we're seeing right now is that you have that person who's basically being held hostage by a 3% mortgage. They don't want to go get a 7% mortgage. If this place is not enjoyable and you have the means to handle maybe a slightly bigger mortgage while rates are high, maybe you refinance in 5 years, 10 years, whatever, that might be a way to get a do-over. Because if you're not happy today, you're not going to get happy over time.
At the end of the day, you don't want to regret what you did. You want to minimize regret.
My husband and I are at the end of our careers, and we've always thought about relocating to Delaware for retirement thanks to the lower taxes in that state.
However, that puts us about 6-hour drive from family, which is not ideal.
Is it possible to buy a second property to use our primary residence for tax purposes while still keeping our original home near our family?
I'm not a huge fan of relocating to a state just because of the lower taxes. Again, we are not going to financially plan and let the tax tail wag the dog, so to speak. So if you are going to Delaware, because there's something special about Delaware and something you wanted to do in Delaware, that is a better way of planning to move there rather than just the fact that the taxes are lower. Because what you also find in a lot of these lower or no tax states is that something else may be a little bit more expensive. If we use Florida as an example, insurance is harder to get, property taxes may be a little bit harder. So when we're doing the math itself about you moving to a low income tax state, maybe it's not the best idea if all that's taking you there is the fact that they have a lower tax or no tax.
So yes, this is always the check with your CPA type question first, but for most states, 6 months and 1 day is considered residency, that you can still deem that to be your primary residence and favorable taxes. But what is that second property going to cost? How are you going to pay for it, right? And really going, if you're now going to be renting one of the properties, that's now income. There's tax issues, there's liability issues. If you've never owned a retirement home, trying to do that learning curve in retirement sometimes is steep. And what I found is sometimes renting out the primary residence is very easy, but then also hiring a property manager takes some of that worry, and you can find the happy medium that maybe you're not going to have the 6-hour commute all the time, because in your 80s, you may not like that 6-hour commute. So we can explore that option with your CPA to go, how do we find this delicate balance on second property from assets, tax savings, liability protections on the primary residence?
So when we talk about buying a second property and using as our primary for residence for tax purposes, maybe just take whatever costs you're able to build into a cash flow plan and put that into some sort of travel budget, or put that into some form of a longer term rental, right? So maybe not for family, but think about things in terms of you just want to have a second home, right? Well, instead of that, just figure out what it's going to cost you, inflate it maybe by 5%, 10%. That's the price of making it somebody else's problem. So you go, you're there for a month, 2 months, 3 months, but then when you're gone, you turn those keys over and then it's somebody else's problem.
Whenever we are doing financial planning, we do bucket these goals, right? It is literally just a math equation, making sure that if you do this, what's the consequences of that? Where does the money come from if we put all these goals together? You do not need to maintain 2 properties in retirement if you don't want to, especially if it's just a residence somewhere and another residence somewhere else. It is different than having a beach house. One good example is I have retired clients buying their next car, and they insist on buying a minivan because they have the grandkids. And I'm saying, drive your daughter or son's minivan when you have the kids. You can literally switch cars. You do not have to have the $50,000 car just because you want to make it convenient for everybody else, right? Similar to, you do not have to, keep your residence at the old state simply because it allows you to come visit with family. Maybe they have a guest room. I joke with my kids all the time, I'm gonna have an RV, park it on their driveway, we're good to go. I don't bother them, maybe plug in whatever needs to be plugged in, and we are good to go there.
But if you've never lived there and you don't know what it is culturally, socially, it may not be worth it, right? And that's why I say, explore the environment first, taxes second, right? Because if no taxes, Nevada, no taxes. Are you prepared for 115-degree weather? No taxes, right? Texas, humid, no taxes. Don't do it tax specific. Find a place you can enjoy, and hopefully the cost of living is reasonable. Try it on for size. But taxes shouldn't be the only reason to choose a state. So I have a client, he 20 minutes from my office in Gilbert, Arizona. Day one, met him. Our plan is to move to North Carolina to be close to our daughters. Okay, have you ever been there? Just visiting. Okay, are you sure? Yeah. Before he retired, he intentionally took a pay cut and a transfer with his company so he could go there and still owned his own Gilbert house. So he and his wife moved there in his last year of working, stayed there for a year, basically on the company dime. We were right, Jason. This is where we want to be. We like the weather, we like the temperature, and then they eventually sold their house. So it was a perfect executed plan, and I couldn't fault him for doing it because, again, he was now 30 minutes from each of his daughters, all the grandkids, they were never going anywhere. And he was able to give more support to his oldest daughter, whose husband had passed away. So they made a family decision that we're going to help our daughter in her retirement years as she's navigating this new world. Executed it flawlessly. Now, in retirement, it's now, who are you now? You're now retired. What does that look like? What does that feel like? Who are the man you're becoming now? Because his wife, her retirement was easy. She's figured it out very quickly. He's now trying to figure out the interpersonal side of retirement.
What I encourage clients to really think about is, what are you trying to accomplish? Do you really want to be closer to the kids? Or are you doing this as an investment? Or are you doing this for some sort of longer term estate planning, right? You're buying the house and then you want to give it to the kids or the grandkids down the road. If you can't quantify what you're trying to accomplish here, then anything else that you pick just isn't going to work. Do you just want to be somewhere for 2 months at a time? Okay, build that cost into your plan and make it somebody else's problem. In this question, are you just trying to be close to family more often? Okay, figure out other ways to make that work. But again, if this is a care issue, right? If you do need to be closer to the kids to help with grandkids, if health is an issue, if you are looking at estate planning, I get it. But you have to be able to run to the problem with this, answer these questions, because otherwise you're going to be spending far more money at the worst possible time. For the first time, you are your own retirement paycheck, and you have to understand where every single dollar is coming from. So that first year of retirement, be very, very careful about all these things that you're spending, not the least of which would be a second home to be 6 hours closer to the kids.